Larry, the rubber is about to meet the road here in the Citizens Grand Jury as we prepare to present the grand jurors with the indictment against, it pains me to even say this, U.S. President Joseph Robinette Biden. How are you today, Larry?
Doing as well as anybody can be expected under the circumstances, Jason. We live in very dire times, very serious times. Most of the American people, frankly, it hasn't registered with them what we're going through and what's going to happen into the future, not just with regard to Afghanistan, but with regard to everything. But let's deal with the issue at hand, which is obtaining the indictment of Joseph Biden, our so-called president of the United States. I say so-called because, frankly, the election's still being contested with regard to various audits and other things like that. But there's new information in addition to what we presented at our last Citizens Grand Jury. And I think it's pretty well encapsulated in two broadcasts today on Fox News. So I want to play them first, and then we'll get into the actual indictment. There are a few other clips as well. But the bottom line here is that not only have Americans been stranded in Afghanistan, not only have Afghan allies been stranded, not only are people coming into the country from Afghanistan that we have no idea who they are, which is a security threat. Not only does the Taliban now have $85 billion worth of equipment, which they're obviously going to make available, not just for themselves, but ISIS, Al-Qaeda, China, Russia, our adversaries. But in addition to that, Biden ordered a drone strike shortly after the American servicemen were killed, the 13, and other Americans and Afghans, basically to show that he was the tough guy, that in fact he could control what was going on in the Taliban. And apparently they had no idea who they were killing. They killed innocent civilians and they killed children, and then now they won't even identify who they are. This is the worst act, I think, of any president in our lifetime for sure. And it is despicable, it is criminal, and he must be held accountable for that and everything else. But let's, of course, play these clips because I think it summarizes where we are in this Citizens Grand Jury process. And Biden and his minions offer no explanation for any of this. They just have hunkered down the fort. They refuse to even let him answer questions at press conferences. And not only do we have a lot of direct so-called evidence, but circumstantial evidence that Biden is guilty of criminal homicide, manslaughter, negligent homicide, treason, and other acts of criminality for which he must be held accountable. So let's roll the videotape, so to speak.
Hey guys, good morning. Here we go. Day two begins in about an hour. Back on the hot seat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The chaos in Kabul will be front and center. It got hot yesterday. We'll see how it goes. Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Hemmer as we get ready for that. Que pasa?
Oh, very well. Que pasa?
It's a
little early for my Spanish, if you forgive me. I'm Dana Perino. This is America's Newsroom. Though I did get a minor in Spanish.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I could dream in Spanish and everything. But when you said que pasa, I was like, I don't know what he's talking about.
Stumped.
But today's hearing will be in English, actually. The Secretary of State testified for the first time yesterday on America's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. He told the House Foreign Affairs Committee that President Biden inherited a deadline, but not a plan. Republicans did not want to hear it.
This was an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see an unconditional surrender to the Taliban. I can summarize this in one word: betrayal.
I do not believe a word that you're saying on this. I do not wish to hear from you. I'm not
simply put, Congressman, what you said is dead wrong.
I don't wish to hear your lies.
And it is so greatly unfortunate, the consequences, and I believe that you, sir, should resign. That would be leadership.
Senator Mike Rounds is one of the lawmakers who will question Secretary Blinken this morning over on the Senate side. We'll speak to him in just a moment. Peter Doocy has the latest from the White House. But first, let's go to Capitol Hill, where Aisha Hasni is standing by for day two. Hi, Aisha.
Hi, good morning to you, Dana. You know, if this hearing today is anything like it was yesterday, it is sure to draw the ire of Republicans. Secretary of State Antony Blinken yesterday defended the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. At one point, really hitting his message home, saying we inherited a deadline. We did not inherit a plan. But he also revealed that there are still several thousand U.S. green card holders on top of the some 100 citizens still stuck in Afghanistan. Now, there were several heated exchanges with Republicans, including this one moment when Congressman Brian Mast asked him about those leaked transcripts from Biden's call with Afghan President Ghani in July, in which Biden apparently tried to persuade Ghani to change the perception. Listen.
That the issue was not whether Afghanistan had the capacity to withstand the Taliban. It's whether it had the will and the plan to do so. He urged him.
The transcript is a lie.
It's
false.
That plan.
It's incorrect.
He did not work to bring people together in unity.
You're saying it's false. It's a lie. It's incorrect. He did not work to tamp down the intelligence on the Taliban.
Absolutely not.
Now, today, you can expect Republicans to ask how current Afghan allies left stranded will get out of there. Why are planes not taking off from Mazar-e-Sharif? And who is actually being evacuated? How are they being vetted? And what's the administration's approach to dealing with the Taliban? Are they a terrorist organization? Although some Senate Democrats would rather focus today's hearing on the past 20 years than the events that happened in August. Senator Chris Murphy adding that he hopes Republicans don't, quote, turn this into a circus. Dana, Blinken will appear at this hearing in person. He got a lot of tough love yesterday from Republicans for appearing virtually for their hearing. Dana?
I know. I thought that it would be a better hearing if they were in person today. I think that is going to happen. Thanks.
So meanwhile, Blinken testified yesterday about 100 Americans still stranded in Afghanistan. This amid new questions on whether a U.S. drone strike really took out any ISIS-K terrorists, as the Biden administration claims. Peter Ducey's on that. North Lawn today at the White House. Hey, Peter?
Bill, lots of questions about that. Not many answers. The Pentagon told us they took out 2 ISIS-K planners with an unmanned drone strike near Kabul a few weeks ago, but since no further details like names.
They have lied, or they may just be that wrong. Understand that when they completely withdrew, the State Department and the Central.
Whoops.
That's fine. Let it run. Let it run.
Intelligence people and the soft people, they lost all their ability to be accurate. So I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt. I suspect they didn't know and they made something up.
And that's as the New York Times is reporting that U.S. drone strike actually killed an aid worker and some unarmed civilians. A question that has now been put directly to the Pentagon on camera.
Confirm, or will you be able to confirm at any point the people's names or identities of those killed in the 2 drone strikes targeting alleged ISIS militants in the last days before the withdrawal was complete? Thanks.
Hey, Phil, thanks. What I can say is I cannot confirm them at this time.
We may get some further details about that when the Secretary of State is back on Capitol Hill today. It is the first time, yesterday and today, that Tony Blinken has been, or any senior Biden officials have been held accountable by another branch of government. So the checks and balances are in action today. White House officials would much rather talk about the economy or about COVID-19, but these lawmakers are very unlikely to ask about that. It should be all Afghanistan, all hearing long. Bill.
We're watching. Thank you, Peter. Peter Ducey at the White House. Dana?
Joining us now.
There you go. There you go, Larry. That's
we see they apparently killed people to say that they had killed ISIS terrorists because this was a political cover for the disaster that occurred that resulted in Biden's negligent homicide, manslaughter, treason, and killing American citizens with his actions. Okay, as we set forth in the indictment, we've slightly updated that indictment to bring it current. We're going to read it to you at the end of this citizen's grand jury. Now let's play the testimony, or rather the questioning, of Ted Cruz of Blinken, which occurred just today.
Americans that they said that they've helped out.
Whoops. Yeah, let me get that. Here we go.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Senator. President Biden and the Biden administration have presided over the worst foreign policy catastrophe in a generation. Americans across the nation are horrified. Our servicemen and women, our active duty military, are angry, they're disillusioned, and they're frustrated. Our enemies across the globe are emboldened, which makes the world more dangerous today for America, and our allies are dispirited. Ever since the disaster began unfolding in Afghanistan, we've seen the Biden administration making political excuses. We've seen Democrats on this committee explaining at great length how everything that happened in Afghanistan is Trump's fault. It's all Trump's fault. Mr. Secretary, Joe Biden is the President of the United States. Kamala Harris is the Vice President of the United States. You are the United States Secretary of State. Just like Jimmy Carter owns the disaster of the Iran hostage crisis, you own this. The Biden administration caused this disaster. It was caused by two things. Number one, ideological naivete and extremism. Repeatedly, Mr. Secretary, in this hearing and also on multiple conference calls over the last month, you keep saying things like the steps the Taliban needs to take to be welcomed into the community of civilized nations. Mr. Secretary, they don't want to be welcomed into the community of civilized nations. They are terrorists who want to murder us. This administration doesn't understand that. Joe Biden doesn't understand that. But sadly, that ideological extremism was combined with manifest incompetence. There were 4 decisions this administration made that I think were utterly indefensible. Number one, abandoning the Bagram airfield, giving it to the Taliban. That is a decision that 100 years from now will be studied at war colleges as a colossal strategic mistake, giving up 2 secure airfields, necessitating an evacuation from a dense urban environment, a commercial airport, which led tragic bombings and murders that killed 13 American servicemen and women. Had we been evacuating from Bagram with a secure perimeter, the odds are quite high. That attack either wouldn't have happened, or if it had happened, it would have been far less severe in its consequences. Secondly, the Biden administration giving the Taliban a list of Americans and of Afghans we wanted out. Third, the decision to leave Americans behind. Hundreds of Americans, perhaps more, perhaps thousands of green card holders, tens of thousands of Afghans who assisted the U.S. military. The Biden administration abandoned them and left them behind. And fourth, leaving billions of dollars of American military equipment that the Taliban will now use to threaten our lives. Earlier in this hearing, you said about that equipment, quote, none of it poses a strategic threat to us or their neighbors. That does not pass the laugh test. When you're looking at the Taliban potentially having 64,000 machine guns, 33 Black Hawk helicopters, 16,000 night vision goggles, we will see American blood spilled because of these colossal mistakes. Now, abandoning Bagram wasn't your call. It was the Pentagon's and the White House's ultimately. But I want to ask you flat out, did the State Department give the Taliban a list or multiple lists of Americans and or Afghans that we wanted out?
Those reports and the idea that we would do anything to endanger our citizens or anyone else at a time when we were trying to save their lives is flat out wrong. Let me,
so just like a yes or no, did you give them
let me be very clear, Senator, if I may, please. Thank you. In limited instances where we were seeking to get a bus or a group of people through a checkpoint, we gave a manifest to the people at the checkpoint to demonstrate that those people were expected.
Roughly how many names were on the list you gave?
Doesn't matter because they all...
Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Give us some order of magnitude.
This happened in a handful of situations where to
Dozens?
get through...
So is it your testimony it wasn't hundreds? I want to understand, did you give them thousands of names?
No, we did not.
Okay, hundreds?
Not going to put a number on it, but it was, again...
Why not? This is a hearing to discover how many names and how many of those individuals you gave the Taliban the name to have been targeted for torture or murder.
Senator, by definition, these were in limited instances with a bus or a group of people to get them through a checkpoint. They got through the checkpoint.
So not only did you fail to evacuate Americans and green card holders who were there, but you also brought in tens of thousands of Afghans who had wholly inadequate vetting, bringing many of them to the United States. And one of the things that is done brought in a humanitarian crisis to America. Child marriage and domestic abuse, tragically, are widespread in Afghanistan. According to the World Health Organization, more than half of the women in Afghanistan are married as child brides, and 90% of women are subject to domestic abuse. 90%. On August 27th, according to public reports, you distributed internal documentation highlighting numerous instances in intake centers of sexual abuse in which much older grown Afghan males appeared with children, young children, claimed they were their brides, claimed they were their wives, and the document said the State Department urgently requested guidance. That was your word, urgently. Subsequently, the Department of Homeland Security said that it showed the desperation of families, that they were willing to give little girls to grown men to be subject to sexual abuse and child wives. My question is as follows. Did you receive that urgent guidance? How many children have been subject to sexual abuse? What have you done to rescue young children from illegal and abusive relationships after being brought to America by the State Department?
Across the entire government, everyone involved in the evacuation effort, whether it's at a transit point in one of the countries that we negotiated with, whether it's here in the United States at Dulles or Philadelphia or the military bases. We have all of our officers at extreme vigilance to look for and to cases or concerns that arise.
Did you receive the urgent guidance, and how many child brides have you seen?
I don't referring to. I'm happy to look at it.
So is there not urgency to discover if children are being abused?
Absolutely.
Time of the senator has expired.
We could detect and deal with any cases, and there have been, to my knowledge, a limited number of cases where we have separated people because we were concerned that they were.
How many?
The cases I'm aware of, a handful.
I have to hand it to Ted Cruz, Larry. He's extremely good at cross-examining witnesses.
Well, he did very well. I think this is probably his better calling rather than senator because he has no power as senator, but the rest of the senators there to take any action. But yes, he's very bright, and he doesn't need a teleprompter, and he doesn't, say So I give him credit for that. Let's play some of the other video that we have, Jason, dealing with the killing of the children. And then we'll move on, and I'll give an introduction. We'll be seeking the indictment and presenting it at that time.
For not doing anything wrong. She was beaten very badly. She was humiliated. And they ran a car over her. They then threw her body on the river, a dry river, cobbled river, and then they burned her. This was simply to raise our voices against the brutality on women, and of course, for people not to forget about this incident. I get mixed reaction in social media. Basically, they were saying that my clothes were provocative and I didn't wear a headscarf. I don't understand.
Larry, we've got some more clips. This is an Afghani actress describing a circumstance.
Right, this is the clip about beating of women and harming women. Now we'll go to the other clips.
In Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, life here is changing rapidly under the new regime of the Taliban. Now that the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has been proclaimed and that replaced the Afghan Republic that was deposed in the middle of August. Already, the city is changing visibly before our eyes. The visual transformation is quite striking. The city used to be covered with graffiti, with paintings of Afghan national heroes, of women activists, of historical figures. Now a fresh coat of paint is going all over that, and increasingly the slogans of the Islamic Emirate are replacing the visuals that used to characterize Kabul. As you walk around, you can see that merchants are walking in between cars, selling big and small flags of the Islamic Emirate. The white flag with the Islamic scripture that has replaced the black, red and green flag of the now deposed Republic of Afghanistan. There are protests now every day, mostly led by women that are being dispersed by the Taliban and yet continue day after day. The Taliban have proven themselves to be a highly successful military force. However, their fighters don't have much experience with the peaceful street protests that we're seeing now. They haven't been trained, they don't have riot equipment, and what they do is shoot in the air, sometimes missing and hitting buildings. The fact that the new government doesn't include any women says a lot by itself. And so that is the reason why many of them are protesting, many of them are in the streets saying, if this government stays the way it is, if there is no transformation, that a lot of the achievements over the last 20 years, at least in the urban areas of Afghanistan, will be gone forever. While the Taliban haven't yet spelled out what rules they will implement, many Afghan women are preoccupied. They're preoccupied and alarmed by the fact that they will probably not be able to continue working in many professions, that educational opportunities will be reduced. That government has already received a degree of international criticism and has not been recognized by anyone, and yet for now it seems to be in firm control of the city despite these occasional demonstrations.
Quite striking, Larry, to see the Taliban patrolling the streets of Kabul in American uniforms.
Well, that's to rub it in our face. That's to rub our noses in it. That's obviously the case.
Well, also it's better equipment than they had previously, so they're quite a bit more capable than they might have been before Joe Biden got involved in this disaster.
Yeah, let's roll the next videotape, then we'll sum it all up, Jason. Thank you.
Right. Here we go.
And we've got some breaking news coming in from Afghanistan now. It continues to be one of our big stories. Afghanistan's caretaker president, Amrullah Saleh's brother, Rohullah, has reportedly been tortured and executed by the Taliban in Afghanistan's Panjshir province. Rohullah Saleh has reportedly been killed after a late-night clash in the Panjshir Valley. The whereabouts of Amrullah Saleh himself, the self-proclaimed president of Afghanistan, is not known, though his aides say that he is still in the Panjshir Valley. The Taliban currently controls over half of the Panjshir Valley, though the resistance says they are still in control. But Rohullah Saleh, the brother of Amrullah Saleh, reportedly executed by the Taliban as part of its Panjshir takeover.
Jason, also throw up on the screen again that first article about killing of the children.
Sure.
Thank you.
Was that this one?
First thing that you put up.
This one.
Yeah, there you go. Let's take a look at that. Will my assistant Asher Anderson read that into the record, please?
You got to unmute, Asher.
Sorry, guys. It felt like hell itself had opened up, said Ramal Ahmadi, who was watching cartoons with his nephew when a U.S. drone slammed into his family's courtyard, where just moments before there had been a noisy celebration to greet the family's oldest brother. The last thing Ahmadi remembers was the sound of his brother's car horn announcing his arrival and the squealing of the children. He says his mind is not right since that day. Sunday's U.S. drone strike killed 10 members of his family, 6 of them children, Ahmadi said. Senior U.S. military officials said the drone strike hit an Islamic State target and weakened the extremist group's ability to further disrupt the final phase of the U.S. withdrawal and evacuation of thousands of people from Afghanistan. 3 days before the drone strike, an ISIS suicide bomber had attacked a crowded gate at Kabul airport, killing 13 U.S. service members and 169 Afghans. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said Wednesday that at least one of those killed in the drone strike was an Islamic State facilitator. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki acknowledged the reports of civilian casualties on Thursday and said they were being investigated. Previously, American officials have noted that subsequent explosions resulted from the destruction of the vehicle and may have caused additional casualties.
Okay, that's sufficient. You saw today, earlier in the video clip that we played for you on America's Newsroom, that the military will not say who they killed. This obviously was an attempt to create an impression politically, for political purposes, by Joe Biden. He is the commander-in-chief. As was true with Obama, he has to order the drone strikes to cover for his criminal negligence at best and treason in causing the deaths of 12 American servicemen, wounding others, and the deaths of hundreds of Afghans at the Kabul airport. What could be worse? What could be more cynical than to order a drone strike when you don't even know who you're killing, just for political purposes, you can say that you struck back? This president, and our indictment is mild compared to what he should be charged with. We are presenting it shortly. Mr. Anderson will read it. He is going to have to answer in front of God as well as to answer in front of a citizen's grand jury, because this is the most despicable act, the most criminally minded act that we know of any American president in modern history. You take it all together. And Senator Ted Cruz summed it up extremely well. Also, the testimony of Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State. We'll get to him next week. We'll seek his indictment next week. We'll also seek the indictment of Kamala Harris, because she says that she was fully part of what went on. All of these people need to be held accountable under the rule of law, under the law, not just of man, but of God and natures of God. And we need to hold them accountable because there's no other way to do it. President Biden's not going to be impeached by a Democrat Congress, and even if there wasn't, they wouldn't impeach him. Needs 2/3 conviction in the Senate to remove. We've never impeached a president in 245 years. He's not going to be held accountable in our courts with our corrupt and politicized judges who would never hold him accountable. And of course, we have the Biden Justice Department, which acts more like a Gestapo to quell any kind of protest and dissent from persons who disagree with the way they're administering to the law. And there's no obvious other recourse. So the American people need to rise up through citizens' grand juries peacefully and legally. I'm going to read the indictment. We're going to ask the grand jurors to deliberate on it and to come back to us either later today or tomorrow to elect a foreman to sign the indictment. We're asking that you return this true bill of indictment. We will then move on to schedule a trial. We will put President Biden on notice of the charges against him. He will have an opportunity to defend himself. He can come with his lawyers. He'll have an opportunity to participate in voir dire and selecting a jury of his peers and of our peers the American people's peers. We will move on, and I'm confident that we'll get a conviction. And once we do, we'll recommend a sentence of life imprisonment, and we'll ask the police and sheriffs and the military to enforce that sentence. He needs to be held accountable by the United States as it exists, not by our current government, which is impotent and will not take any action, but will simply be playing games, political games. And that's what the Republicans are doing, because they think this is going to get them control of the House of Representatives, of the Senate, perhaps the presidency. It's not. But in any event, that's why they knew, and they had reason to know, that this was going to happen in Afghanistan, but they hung back because, frankly, they wanted to politically hang Biden, and they didn't want to give us the clarion call of what was going to be going on. Our national security has been destroyed. We are in extreme jeopardy right now from a number of ways, as expressed by Senator Cruz. I don't need to repeat them. That was done in a very succinct way. So consequently, I'm going to ask Mr. Anderson to read this proposed indictment, and I ask the grand jurors to go off and to deliberate, to return a true bill of indictment, to have a foreman elected and to sign it, and then we will move on to the trial of Joseph Robinette Biden. Mr. Anderson?
Have you got the screen share, Asher? I think you're back on mute. Asher, can you unmute?
I got it. Yeah, okay, go ahead and share it from the top, please.
There you go.
All right, this is before the Citizens Grand Jury, the people of the United States of America versus Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of Wilmington, Delaware. The criminal indictment and our general allegations. This Citizens Grand Jury indictment redresses the deaths of U.S. military personnel and civilians caused by the manner of which President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knowingly and willfully abandoned U.S. citizens and U.S. allies, or Afghan U.S. allies, to terrorists and mortal enemies of the United States. In addition, he ordered a drone strike after U.S. military and Afghan allies were killed and wounded at the Kabul airport despicably for political purposes, which resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians, including children. To date, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.'s administration will not name or identify who they killed to create a false impression that he was retaliating, or the deaths of our military, citizens, and Afghan allies. It is not within the scope of this indictment to decide whether or not the United States military presence in Afghanistan should have, or whether the previous administration should or should not have handled the issue differently. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was elected to the U.S. Senate as a senator from the state of Delaware in 1972 and was reelected continuously through the November 2008 election. In November 2008, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was elected nationwide as vice president in Barack Obama's administration. On or about November 3rd, 2020, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was deemed elected president of the United States. For decades in the U.S. Senate and during Barack Obama's election campaigns for president in 2008 and 2012, and his campaign in 2020 to be elected president, and thereafter, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. claimed and claims to be and was reputed to be a national expert in foreign policy and international relations. President Barack Obama selected Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. as his vice presidential running mate in spite of the small size of Biden's home state of Delaware in the Electoral College. Obama was largely perceived to have done this because he had little foreign policy experience, while Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. presented himself and was accepted by the Washington, D.C. establishment and news media as being highly knowledgeable in international relations and possessing a keen understanding of the United States' role in the world relative to other countries. By his own admissions, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has studied and is familiar with the history of Afghanistan, including the invasion by the Soviet Union, the coalition of Islamic jihadi fighters who defeated the Soviet army the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and the U.S. military response to the Taliban as part of his focus and supposed expertise in international relations from 1973 through 2021. In 2001, the government of Afghanistan was dominated by a terrorist force known as the Taliban. In 2001, the United States demanded that the Taliban-led government of Afghanistan hand over to the United States for prosecution alleged al-Qaeda leader and mastermind of the 9/11 attacks on the United States, Osama bin Laden, along with other al-Qaeda leaders and fighters. Then U.S. President George W. Bush further demanded that the Taliban leaders end any support, sanctuary, or comfort for al-Qaeda within Afghanistan's borders. On September 11, 2001, and continuous to today, Taliban leaders maintain the United States gas presented no evidence that Osama bin Laden played any role in the attacks and has refused to comply with U.S. demands. When the Taliban failed to remove its support for the protection of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, a coalition of nations led by the United States and the United Kingdom invaded Afghanistan on December 17, 2001. During the 20-year military presence of the United States in Afghanistan, the U.S. military trained members of the Afghan army in the use and maintenance of U.S. military equipment and vehicles, including Humvees, MRAP, attack vehicles, Black Hawk helicopters, sophisticated surveillance drones, advanced night vision optics, explosive ordnance, light arms, ammunition, body armor, and more. On January 20, 2017, Donald J. Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. During his term of office, President Trump made plans and implemented directives to end the military presence of the United States in Afghanistan. The Trump administration negotiated a detailed agreement that specified milestones and described a proposed timeline for the drawdown and withdrawal of the U.S. military from Afghanistan. The specific details of this negotiation are beyond the scope of this indictment. The Trump administration proposed the target date of May 1, 2021 for the withdrawal of the United States military from Afghanistan, provided the Taliban upheld the agreement and did not attack or thwart U.S. personnel. After the United States, United Kingdom, and a coalition of other countries overthrew the Taliban government in 2001 and 2002, the people of Afghanistan created their own constitution, ratified the Afghanistan constitution, and conducted several elections by the people of Afghanistan choosing their elected leaders under the Afghanistan constitution. The Trump administration conducted negotiations and created plans both with the legitimate elected constitutional government of Afghanistan and the renegade terrorist Taliban forces which threatened it, who were illegal and illegitimate under the Afghanistan constitution. The Trump administration's terms for military withdrawal included a requirement that the Taliban acknowledge the elected government of Afghanistan pursuant to the Afghanistan constitution as the legitimate power of Afghanistan. As the Trump administration came to an end in late 2020, the Taliban increasingly violated their assurances and conditions of the U.S. withdrawal and began taking cities and provinces by force, seizing control from the legitimate constitutional government of Afghanistan. On November 3, 2020, the United States presidential election took place amid controversy stemming from allegations of fraud and other election irregularities, including but not limited to massive use of mail-in ballots and lack of bona fide voter identification in key swing states. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was elected. On January 2021, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was sworn in as President of the United States of America. As President, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. began a dramatic and rapid-paced campaign of reversing numerous significant decisions and policies of the Trump administration by issuing record-breaking numbers of executive orders in his first week in office, explicitly overturning Trump administration decisions and policies. President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. deviated from President Trump's plans for the military withdrawal, including changing the withdrawal date from May 1, 2021 to August 31st of 2021. On or about April 13th, 2021, the Associated Press reported that sources within the Biden administration indicated that President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. would withdraw all troops from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. In defiance of the Trump administration agreement, President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. changed the date of the withdrawal from May 1 to August 31. Critics of President Biden claimed he picked the date for arbitrary political reasons and for his own benefit, anticipating he will be revered for ending the war at the time of remembrances of September 11th, 2021. On or about July 6, 2021, the Associated Press reported that U.S. military commanders and personnel shut down and abandoned Bagram Air Force Base. This included cutting electrical power to the base and providing no information or warning to Afghan commanders charged with operating the base. In a press conference on or around August 27, 2021, President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. affirmed that his U.S. military and intelligence advisors determined Bagram Air Force Base was of no significant value. President Biden reaffirmed his decision to deliberately close a large, sophisticated, defensible air base more than 1 month prior to the scheduled exfiltration of U.S. Citizens, U.S. allies, military personnel, and equipment. After Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was sworn in as president, the Taliban's military attacks accelerated, and in violation of their commitments to the Trump administration, the Taliban conquered more and more towns, cities, and provinces. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. ignored these accelerating provocations and violations of the Taliban's commitments that the Taliban would honor the elected constitutional government of Afghanistan. Taliban insurgents on August 11, 2021 captured airports in the Afghan provinces of Farah and Kunduz, and the U.S. military withdrew. Reports also said the insurgents took control of an Afghani Army Corps base in Kunduz after hundreds of soldiers surrendered to them. On August 11, 2021, at the direction of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the U.S. military abandoned and provided to the Taliban around 100 U.S.-made Humvees and Max Pro mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, also known as MRAPs, as well as U.S. Scan Eagle drones, hundreds of high-powered military automatic weapons, the Kunduz airport, and about $85 billion of other sophisticated American weaponry throughout the country. On or about August 2021, at the direction of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the U.S. military left behind thousands of prisoners, including al-Qaeda terrorists who had been imprisoned at the airbase. As a result, the Taliban released the prisoners, adding to their numbers of fighters and terrorists in their assault upon the elected government of Afghanistan. Following Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.'s orders, the U.S. military abandoned massive quantities of military vehicles, aircraft, and equipment at Bagram. As a result, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.'s orders fueled the rapid conquest of Afghanistan by replenishing the ranks to the Taliban fighters and arming the Taliban with military equipment, weapons, and supplies. Reportedly, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.'s orders provided the Taliban with enough military aircraft to have an air force larger than around 100 countries, including Australia. Although some observers scoffed at that the Taliban would not be able to use these aircraft, members of the Afghan army trained by the U.S. military defected to the Taliban and have been in fact able to fly Black Hawk helicopters and other U.S. military vehicles and airplanes. As a result, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. further created an extremely dangerous situation by arming and replenishing the ranks of the Taliban forces, soon attacking the city of Kabul, Afghanistan. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knowingly and willfully created an unreasonable and extreme danger of death, torture, imprisonment, kidnapping, hostage-taking, slavery, and or rape to U.S. citizens and Afghan contractors to the U.S. government. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knew during these events that an estimated 11,000 to 49,000 U.S. citizens were present at that time in Afghanistan, not only in the capital of Kabul, but throughout the countryside of Afghanistan. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knew that thousands of Afghanistan nationals worked as employees or contractors of the U.S. military and or U.S. embassy in various roles as translators, guides, advisors, drivers, support staff, etc. during the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan by the coalition countries, including the United States. As a part of the U.S. military's personnel, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. owed these Afghans under conditions of military conflict, which he created, protection, along with the U.S. military and U.S. citizens. It was at all times relevant herein and is now Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. duty to safeguard the safety of U.S. civilians. It was at all times relevant herein and is now Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.'s duty to know or find out which U.S. citizens were present in Afghanistan. Because every U.S. citizen traveling abroad is issued on request a U.S. passport and is processed through international travel with that passport, it was possible for Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. to know or order the identification of all U.S. citizens present in Afghanistan through the U.S. State Department, the Embassy of Afghanistan in Washington, D.C., still under the control of the legitimate constitutional government of Afghanistan, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Passport records, visa records from the Afghanistan embassy, and travel records could be assembled to identify all U.S. citizens who had traveled to Afghanistan and in contact with those citizens who determine if they had left safely. Instead, despite publicly stating there were at least 11,000 U.S. civilian citizens in Afghanistan, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. directed the evacuation of only about 6,000 U.S. civilian citizens. Specifically, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. chose to maintain the withdrawal deadline of August 31st, 2021 at the expense of intentionally, knowingly, and willfully leaving U.S. citizens, including civilians, abandoned and stranded inside Afghanistan behind enemy lines at risk of death, injury, and imprisonment as hostages. Republican members of Congress tried to get legislation passed that would require the U.S. military to remain in Afghanistan until such time and with a sufficient force to protect and transport every U.S. citizen, including diplomats and civilians, out of Afghanistan. But the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, refused to allow a vote on the bill. Furthermore, the U.S. State Department, under the direction of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., demanded payment of $2,000 US per person for U.S. citizens other than employees of the U.S. Embassy to be flown out of harm's way, harm created by Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. from Kabul airport. When Republican members of Congress filed legislation to prohibit the Biden administration for charging U.S. citizens to be saved from the danger of being left behind among the anti-American Taliban terrorists, the Biden administration dropped the requirement. However, the demand for payment to leave Afghanistan, including in official State Department forms and communications, discouraged U.S. citizens from finding their way to the airport to be evacuated, directly increasing the likelihood of U.S. citizens being stranded in Afghanistan. Furthermore, as continued news flowed out, including contacts with U.S. members of Congress from the ground of U.S. citizens being beaten, harassed, blocked, and questioned by the Taliban, trying to reach the Kabul airport to escape, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. prohibited military action outside of the security ring around Kabul airport, prohibiting the U.S. military from traveling out in force and rescuing those U.S. citizens from chaotic crowds out in the city dominated by Taliban terrorists. In fact, reports continue to flow out of Kabul that when U.S. citizens showed their U.S. passports at Taliban checkpoints to try to reach the U.S. evacuation at the Kabul airport, the Taliban terrorists routinely grabbed, stole, and confiscated the U.S. passports. Nevertheless, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. took no action and restrained the U.S. military from taking action to send military forces out in strength and to rescue these U.S. citizens and or escort them safely to the airport. Instead of taking all necessary action, including keeping the U.S. military in Afghanistan as long as necessary to evacuate all U.S. citizens, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. stuck to the arbitrary and political deadline of August 31st, 2021. Apologies. That is, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. put the political goals of meeting that arbitrary deadline above and ahead of the safety and well-being of U.S. citizens. Giving a speech to the nation on August 31st, 2021, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. admitted that he had abandoned in war-torn Afghanistan about 10% of the Americans who remained there, evacuating only about 90%. The president, during the speech, said, "The bottom line, now that the U.S. evacuations are complete and service members will not be shuttling Americans and high-risk Afghans out of the country, is only 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to leave. And for those remaining Americans, there is no deadline. We will remain committed to get them out if they want to come out. However, from other pronouncements, the number abandoned could be between 6,000 and 40,000 U.S. citizens scattered throughout the entire country of Afghanistan, not just in the capital city of Kabul. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was unable to say how many Americans were left in Afghanistan after the military finished withdrawing from the country. On Tuesday's broadcast of MSNBC's Haley Jackson reports, Representative Andy Kim stated that his office has received more than 11,000 requests for evacuation from Afghanistan and has been pushing on requests from Americans that are still in the country. Kim further stated that many of them have been stuck outside the airport gates for hours, and now that the final planes have left, they are left with a lot of concern about what comes next, and they have a lot of questions. Kim stated, "My office, we've been inundated. We've now hit over 11,000 evacuation requests. The ones that we've been pushing the hardest on right now are the Americans that we still know are there in Afghanistan. And I'll tell you, it's been really tough for the last few days, just hearing how difficult it's been for them. Many of them been stuck outside the airport gates for hours. And now that the final planes have left, they are left with a lot of concern about what comes next, and they have a lot of questions. So we, as a nation, need to respond. Massive, sophisticated private efforts to evacuate U.S. citizens and Afghans who serve the U.S. military, such as former U.S. military members codenamed Task Force Pineapple Express, report that the U.S. State Department, at the direction of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., has fought them at every step to prevent the rescue of U.S. citizens and Afghan allies. A similar effort by the Nazarene Fund, led by Glenn Beck and others, funded $28 million in donations, reported that the U.S. State Department, reporting to Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., were standing in the way of evacuations from Afghanistan. The Nazarene Fund reported that several neighboring countries to Afghanistan had already stepped up to take in Afghan refugees. However, the U.S. Department under Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. told these governments to stop taking in the Afghan refugees. When Oklahoma Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen arrived in neighboring Tajikistan with a large amount of cash to hire a helicopter to go into Afghanistan so he could rescue a family of 5 Americans, 1 woman and her 4 children, the U.S. Embassy refused to help this mission to rescue 5 U.S. civilian citizens and actively blocked Representative Mullen's efforts to get these Americans out of Afghanistan. Representative Victoria Spartz said that her office has been in contact with an American left in the country by the Biden administration. She added that the person she was in contact with was not assisted by the offices set up by Biden's administration before the withdrawal was complete. Spartz wrote to President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., "In aftermath of your administration's mishandled withdrawal from Afghanistan, it is estimated that hundreds of Americans wishing to leave Afghanistan were abandoned and remain in the Taliban-controlled country, facing terror and death." As just one example, a 3-year-old born near Sacramento with an American passport is stranded in Afghanistan, unable to leave the country, according to KGO, a Bay Area affiliate of ABC. The report hides the child's identity and his family members in fear of being captured by the Taliban terrorists. James Brown is a veterans advocate who has been working with Democrat Representative Jackie Speier in her California office to get the family back to the United States safely. At least 24 students from the Sacramento Sacramento area are confirmed to be still stranded in Afghanistan. San Juan Unified School District staff said 24 students had not returned. After the final withdrawal of U.S. troops on August 30th, 2021, the students were still in Afghanistan. The willful actions and non-actions of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. already resulted in the murder of 13 U.S. servicemen and at least tens of U.S. servicemen wounded and the deaths of hundreds of Afghans who were loyal to and worked for the United States in its efforts to defeat the Taliban. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has given orders through the Department of State not to cooperate fully with the private efforts by American patriots who are attempting to extract American citizens and Afghan allies from Afghanistan. As a result, private rescue missions and planes have been denied the ability to land at airports. Here are accounts. Count 1, criminally negligent homicide, covered within the broad reach of 18 U.S.C. 51. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. The crime of criminally negligent homicide involves causing someone's death by acting in a manner that was reckless, inattentive, or careless. As required to indict, the prosecution has shown, A, that the defendant knew that their behavior included unjustifiable risk and that this caused another person to die. For instance, should someone be accidentally shot after playing with a gun and a second person does not phone medical help, that person could be charged with negligent homicide, as this is an unjustifiable risk since everyone is expected to know a shot wound can lead to death. B, that an act of omission took place. In some states, causation doesn't have to be demonstrated and omission is enough for a charge. Using the example above of the gunshot wound, the state would have to prove that the defendant would have lived if the other did phone for medical help. There is a causation. There is causation. Often causation has to be demonstrated through an affirmative act. For instance, if someone drives over the speed limit in a school zone when children are exiting the school and hits and kills a child, there is clear cause and effect relationship. Negligent homicide, in other words, happens when someone causes the death of another through criminal negligence. Criminal negligence happens when someone behaves in a way that he or she should have known is risky. It is a much lower intent, but still a serious crime. By the actions of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., tens, if not hundreds of U.S. citizens and Afghans still suffered death, and many will suffer death, imprisonment, torture, beatings, enslavement, and or rape. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knowingly and willfully created an unjustified and foreseeably dangerous circumstance at the small city civilian airport in Kabul, Afghanistan, besieged by Taliban fighters. By surrendering the rest of the country, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. created a circumstance in which the Taliban fighters throughout the country of Afghanistan were able to concentrate in Kabul to surround, harass, and impede the evacuations from Kabul airport. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. creating a concentrated kill zone in the packed crowds around the civilian Kabul airport. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. negligently caused the foreseeable death of at least 13 U.S. Marines and other Marines seriously wounded, as well as the deaths of around 100 Afghan nationals when a Taliban or ISIS suicide bomber and other terrorist shooters, obviously aligned with the anti-American and anti-Afghan terrorist interests of the Taliban, attacked, maimed, and killed the crowds assembled around Kabul airport trying to escape the country. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. also has abandoned as many as 6,000 U.S. citizens by his administration's own early numbers, distributed throughout Afghanistan, and removed their protection of the U.S. military, such that hundreds of U.S. citizens will be killed, injured, tortured, enslaved, and or raped. Count 2, involuntary manslaughter. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein and with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. Involuntary manslaughter is defined as an unintentional killing that stems from reckless acts which constitute a criminal level of negligence. In the alternative to reckless acts, the crime can also be a death that results from an unlawful act that is considered a misdemeanor or lower level felony. The basis of this crime, when compared to voluntary manslaughter, is that the victim's death was unintentional. As per the first element of this crime, there is probable cause that someone was killed as a result of the actions of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. As per the second element of this crime, there's probable cause that the act was either inherently dangerous or that it was inherently dangerous to others, or was done with reckless disregard for the safety of people who could be affected. The reckless disregard of danger to people safely does not require the certainty that death will result, but only the possibility of death. If the accused creates by acts of or failure to act a risk of danger of bodily or of injury or bodily harm, not expecting anyone to die, but in fact, as it turns out, someone actually does die from that danger, the crime of involuntary manslaughter has been committed, and there is probable cause of this as well. As per the third and final element for this crime, there is probable cause that the Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knew or should have known that his or her conduct was a threat to the lives or safety of others. These elements include the accused creating a risk of injury or bodily harm to people short of death, which actually does result in death. That is, if the accused could reasonably foresee that his actions or omissions could result in injury or bodily injury, and in fact, death results instead, the crime of involuntary manslaughter has been committed, there is probable cause of this as well. Reckless disregard of danger to people's safety does not require the certainty of death where the accused actions or failures to act create the possibility of death. There is probable cause of this as well to indict Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. Count 3, reckless endangerment of vulnerable children. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. A person is guilty of reckless endangerment of a child either by wanton or reckless conduct, creating a substantial risk to a child, or wantonly or recklessly failing to take reasonable steps to reduce such a risk. As stated above, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has knowingly placed children, both U.S. citizens and families of U.S. citizens and families of Afghanistan national employees and contractors of the United States military in the hands of vicious terrorists who will mete out revenge and their version of the will of Allah by murdering, tormenting, enslaving, kidnapping, imprisoning, and or raping these children. Through drone strikes for political purposes as set forth above, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. recklessly endangered and in fact murdered civilians and their children. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. knew that he could have used the most powerful military in the world, or the most powerful military the world has ever known, and taken another week or two to evacuate all those who were in danger and needed to be evacuated to either the United States or some other safe country in the region. Count 4, seditious conspiracy, 18 U.S.C. 115. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. The criminal act element required for sedition is either advocating, aiding, organizing, or publishing, or circulating written matter that advocates, aids, or teaches the overthrow of the U.S. government or any state, district, or territory thereof by force or violence, 18 U.S.C. 2385 in 2011. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has acted to arm the enemies of the United States, that is, the terrorist Taliban regime, but also Russia, China, and Iran, to whom the Taliban will sell the approximate $85 billion of sophisticated U.S. military hardware and equipment left behind for these and other enemies of the United States to study and reproduce our best military technology. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has armed to a stunning level equal to or greater than Australia and 100 other nations, not only the terrorist group of the Taliban now in the control of Afghanistan, but also all anti-American terrorist groups. The Taliban in poor Afghanistan will be in great need of money and will experience great pressure foreseeable to Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. to sell U.S. military equipment and weapons to any and all terrorist groups and countries hostile to the United States. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is working actively against the United States in pursuit of his policies of destroying the United States as a separate sovereign nation that puts America first. Count 5, treason, 18 U.S.C. 2381. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. The criminal act element required for treason is that one owes allegiance to the United States, but also levies war against them, the United States, or adheres to the enemies of the United States, or gives the enemies of the United States aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has effectively armed to a stunning level equal to or greater than Australia and 100 other nations, not only the terrorist group of the Taliban, now in control of Afghanistan, but also all anti-American terrorist groups. The Taliban in poor Afghanistan will be in great need of money and will experience great pressure foreseeable to Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. to sell the U.S. military equipment and weapons to any and all terrorist groups and countries hostile to the United States. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has directly or indirectly armed militarily most or all of the enemies of the United States. Furthermore, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has taken these actions to directly benefit China, which has bribed Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. through his son, Hunter Biden. Afghanistan has an estimated $1 trillion worth of rare minerals and metals, notably lithium, which the Afghans do not have the technology and expertise to extract. China, however, has already moved to obtain those rare materials, rare minerals, rare metals, and rare earth for the benefit of China's economy and military expansion program in return for funds badly needed by the Afghan people. Simultaneously, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is working to force U.S. drivers to switch to electric vehicles, which require rechargeable batteries, which require lithium to operate. The U.S. supply of lithium is too small to meet this demand. Thus, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is shepherding the United States economy into dependency upon China, including the necessity of acquiring batteries made with lithium that Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. has just, in effect, gifted to China and other adversaries, such as Russia through the fall of Afghanistan to the financially strapped Taliban. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., through the U.S. Department of State, has thwarted rescue efforts by Americans, including but not limited to retired military, to themselves remove American citizens and Afghan allies from Afghanistan after American forces exited the country on August 30th, 2021, and thus left these persons stranded and in great danger in a terrorist country. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. actions were foreseeable, knowing, and willful well in advance of the actual events, with sufficient time to understand and avoid them. A true person, which will be our elected foreperson, Larry Klayman.
Thank you, Asher.
Yeah, it says at the end, a true bill. Thank you, Asher. That was very good. So now the instructions are to the grand jury to take this indictment. We will also email it to you. Asher will email it to you. Deliberate on it, vote whether you are willing and able to issue that indictment, elect a foreperson, and sign it, and then we will get on to setting up the trial. Hold 1 second, I'll be right back.
And before we close out the session today, I definitely want to remind our viewers to visit freedomwatchusa.org. We can't do these citizens' grand juries or the hard work that Larry and his team at Freedom Watch are doing without the support of you, the viewers. So please make sure you visit freedomwatchusa.org. Your tax-deductible contribution helps Freedom Watch continue its work. And for people who contribute $50 or more, you're going to receive a copy of Larry's book, It Takes a Revolution, Forget the Scandal Industry. Larry, is the updated version out yet?
No, I'm preparing it as we speak. It'll be out in December or January, but the old one makes the point. Okay, so you can purchase this one right now.
Excellent. And with that, Larry, anything else you want to cover today? I think we heard a lot from Ted Cruz, a very concise statement. Anthony Blinken seemed quite nervous, and I want to thank Asher for reading that indictment to us. Anything before we go?
No, I think that's it. Speaks for itself. We presented a lot of information, a lot of evidence. It's also in the public domain. The jurors can draw from their own knowledge because it's out there. It's constant 24/7. So we know what went on in Afghanistan. We know that Joe Biden is responsible for what went on. There are people that worked with him that will be held responsible. Next week, on Thursday, Anthony Blinken, Kamala Harris, others, Susan Rice, who obviously is behind the scenes orchestrating this, another disaster as she did with Benghazi. So we ask for the grand jurors to return that true bill of indictment. This is our only opportunity to hold Biden accountable. It will not be done by the Republicans. It will not be done by Congress. It will not be done in the established courts. But we have a right to do this, as I've said many, many times. So I thank grand jurors for their attention and ask that they return this true bill of indictment.
Absolutely. And this is Team Benghazi, as you point out, Larry. One matter of commentary, not directly relevant to the indictment, but the mainstream press is absolutely complicit in helping Joe Biden sell these crimes to the public as a fantastic effort. And I want to remind people that we are living in a post-constitutional America where Joe Biden's administration is also trampling on the First Amendment. So we've been broadcasting today on the Freedom Watch YouTube channel. I hope that people will subscribe to Freedom Watch on YouTube. The show is also available in simulcast on Rumble and various other channels. People can also support Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to thank the grand jurors and all our viewers across the internet, as well as you, Larry, and Asher, your team there at Freedom Watch. And we will be back a week from Thursday with the next session of the Citizens Grand Jury. Thanks for watching.